This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Oteli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. The blame game all over again. Beijing accuses the Philippines of a deliberate collision in the South China Sea, while Manila fires back, accusing Chinese ships of aggressive maneuvers. Well, the Vietnamese president's high-stakes meeting with his Chinese counterpart. An expert unravels the diplomatic dance behind a complex trade relationship. And the US and South Korea begin annual drills to bolster defense against North Korea, but protesters in the South condemn the exercises as a provocation that could spark nuclear war. And Australia fears slowdown in China's economy, and tumbling iron ore prices could leave a multi-billion-dollar hole in the nation's budget. Ahead on East Asia Tonight, China looks to moviegoers to boost domestic consumption. But how far can free or discounted tickets go? And will it ease restrictions on foreign films? CNA's Lauren Ong goes to the movies in Beijing. Blame and counter-blame from Manila and Beijing over another collision in the South China Sea. Well, today's incident tearing a hole in the side of a Philippine Coast Guard vessel. The new flashpoint is the Sabina Shoal in the disputed Spratly Islands. Beijing says a Philippine vessel intentionally rammed one of its ships, while Manila says two of its Coast Guard ships encountered aggressive maneuvers when en route for supply missions. Well, you are looking at a video released by Chinese state media CCTV saying that the Philippine ship caused the crash by suddenly changing direction. A Chinese spokesperson says the Philippine vessel ignored Coast Guard warnings, labeling the matter a provocation. Manila, however, says asserting its rights in the contested waters is not provocative. The Philippine ships were on a resupply mission for troops in the Spratly Islands. The uninhabited Sabina Shoal is within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, but Beijing claims almost the entire South China Sea. And for more, we are joined now by CNA's Buena Banal from Metro Manila, as well as Tan Hui from Beijing. So first to you, Buena, a collision between Chinese and Philippine vessels on the same day that Manila is holding this forum on the South China Sea. So how are the Philippine authorities interpreting the incident?
Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson for the West Philippine Sea, Mr. J. Tariela, believes that China may have misinterpreted the aim of the mission of these two 44-meter Philippine Coast Guard multi-role response vessels that were damaged in collisions on Monday. And he was saying that China may have thought that these vessels were on their way to resupply Philippine personnel stationed at a larger Philippine vessel called Teresa Magbanwa in Sabina Shoal. And he was saying that that is not the case. Now, Teresa Magbanwa has been stationed in Sabina Shoal since mid-April, monitoring Chinese activities there after the Philippines suspected reclamation activities by China in the area. Mr. Tariela saying that Teresa Magbanwa has been able to minimize Chinese movement in Sabina Shoal. Now, the experts during that Monday morning forum said that China may have wanted to sabotage that resupply mission that China thought was headed to Teresa Magbanwa, the same way that it has sabotaged in the past year and a half resupply missions to a Philippine grounded World War II ship in another area of the sea called Second Thomas Shoal as part of a tactic to disable the logistics component of the Philippines' eyes and ears in Sabina Shoal. Now, Teresa Magbanwa is one of two of the biggest and most modern of the Philippine Coast Guard fleet, and Mr. Tariela was saying that the Philippine Coast Guard has monitored the swarming of Chinese vessels in Sabina Shoal, including a China Coast Guard vessel, Chinese maritime militia vessels, and a Chinese research vessel. So that has been an emerging flashpoint in that area. But the Philippines National Task Force on the West Philippine Sea has clarified that these two vessels were in fact headed to two islands called Lawak and Patag, found in the Philippines' Kalayaan Island group, which is located in the northeastern part of that disputed Spratly Islands, claimed entirely by China, including Taiwan and Vietnam, and partly by the Philippines and Malaysia. Of course, all these is speculative at best, but Mr. Tarriela said that Chinese actions indicate as much because the dangerous maneuvers stopped, he said, when China realized that the two vessels were in fact headed to Lawak and Patag. Now, whatever the intent was from the Chinese side, what is clear is that China is continuing to flex its muscles in the West Philippine Sea, which is how the Philippines calls its maritime zone in the larger South China Sea.
So we've heard the Philippine side. Sihui, let's bring you in now. What about the response by Chinese officials? Any different from prior incidents like the one in June 17th?
We received some new and fresh lines from the Chinese Coast Guards. They have called the actions by the Philippines as extremely bad, and this comes after repeated warnings not to enter their waters. They've also said and described the situation. They had said that two of these Philippine ships had entered the Sabina Shoals, and then one of them allegedly went into the second Thomas Shoal. Now, the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry had touched on the situation earlier today, and they had backed up the Chinese Coast Guard's actions and said that it was accordance with domestic and international law. But there were some strong retaliatory words we heard today. They said that the responsibility of these collisions lies entirely with the Philippines. And they have also said that and alleged that these Coast Guard ships by the Philippines were going into these waters to provide some supplies to the ships that were stranded in the lagoon. So let's take a listen.
鲜滨礁是中国南沙群岛的一部分，是中国的固有领土，也是无人岛礁。菲方派海警船轻闯鲜滨礁海域，企图向在鲜滨礁泻湖滞留的菲律宾海警船实施补给，谋求实现长期存在。菲方此举严重侵犯中国主权，严重违反南海各方行为宣言的规定，严重危害南海和平稳定。中方对此坚决反对，将继续依法采取坚决有力措施，维护自身的领土主权和海洋权益，维护南海各方行为宣言的严肃性。
You asked whether it's any different from what's been said previously, and what we know is that it is a bit of a reiteration because this comes after they set up a mechanism, a communication mechanism between Beijing and Manila for upgraded lines of communication, and even so, they have not touched on or used this communication line. Both sides have also consistently talked about improving maritime communications following a meeting held last month. So what we see in the recent collisions could be seen as a breakdown in talks.
Now, Brenna, give us the bigger picture here. Essentially, how will Manila manage its heightened tensions with Beijing, given that both sides, recently agreed to ease tensions and manage their disagreements?
Well, to be clear, that provisional understanding between the Philippines and China is in relation to the Philippines' rotation and resupply missions to Second Thomas Shoal. And that's because of the June 17 incident, an unprecedented level of violence that saw an elite Filipino Navy personnel's losing his thumb in a brawl with Chinese authorities. So that provisional understanding is limited to that maritime feature. And now we're talking about Sabina Shoal, but in general, what this really equates to is the Philippines strengthening its maritime domain awareness, because the Philippines' weakness in that area in the past has caused disadvantages, including when China was able to reclaim and build military installations in Mischief Reef, another maritime feature within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone back in the 90s, under the guise of building fishermen's shelter. And that is why now there's increased monitoring coming from the side of the Philippines. Philippines' former Associate Justice Antonio Carpio also urged government officials to file a new arbitration case against China, this time in terms of the extended continental shelf of the Philippines, which it had a submission to the United Nations recently. And Philippine government officials also urged the public to support its transparency initiative, which has put a spotlight on Chinese maritime aggression in the South China Sea.
So, Sihui, we've been seeing rising tensions of the South China Sea. Can we expect any measures from Beijing to lower the temperature?
What we do know is that Beijing is unlikely to back down because China's Coast Guard have already said that they will continue enforcement activities in accordance with the law. And some of the reports that have come out previously from China, for example, Communist Party-linked media Global Times, they have said that with regards to the upgraded communication line in June, such a mechanism will depend largely on the Philippines' sincerity in settling the dispute. So we can expect that Beijing is waiting for the Manila side to show political will to resolve the conflict. And reports also say that existing mechanisms are already sufficient. So two sides had also earlier reached a provisional deal this month, but details are scant. It remains unclear at the moment. So from what we see, cooperation from both sides remains at a stalemate.
It's been good talking to you both. Thanks very much, Sihui in Beijing and Buena in Manila. Meantime, German warships could be sailing past the sensitive Taiwan Strait should Berlin give the go-ahead. The move risks stoking tensions with Beijing and could come as early as next month. And this would be the first crossing in more than 20 years for German Navy vessels. It involves a frigate and a replenishment vessel, which are set to call on Tokyo tomorrow. They're also set to stop in South Korea and the Philippines before participating in joint military drills. Germany is already prepared for some company. A senior Navy commander expects the Chinese Navy and potentially the Coast Guard or maritime militia to escort its vessels, calling it a common practice. South Korea and the U.S. have begun their annual summertime military exercises aimed at boosting their defense capabilities against North Korea. Well, the large-scale joint military drills, also known as Ulchi Freedom Shield, rehearses various scenarios of threats originating from North Korea. Well, computer-simulated war games, varying types of field training, and nationwide civil defense evacuation drills are held throughout the 11 days. Each year, the government adds in scenarios unique to evolving security threats on the Korean peninsula, with the so-called gray zone tactics in a spotlight this time.
이번 연습은 북한의 회색지대 및 군사적 복합 도발, 국가 중요 시설 타격을 비롯한 다양한 위기 상황을 상정하여 이에 대응하는 통합적 절차를 숙달하는 데 중점을 둘 것입니다.
North Korea has long denounced Seoul and Washington's joint exercises and has a track record of staging weapons tests in response. South Korea and the U.S., in return, call the exercises a response to the North's threats and are defensive in nature. Well, civic groups in South Korea say that the joint exercises do more harm than good.
이번 을지 자유방패 연습은 한반도와 동북아에서 핵대결과 전쟁의 길을 조장하게 될 것입니다. 핵대결의 끝은 민족의 공멸입니다. 핵대결과 전쟁의 길을 조장하는 을지 자유방패 연습의 중단을 촉구하기 위해 이 자리에 모였습니다.
China and Vietnam have signed more than a dozen agreements, including documents on railways, central bank cooperation and trade. Well, this comes as Vietnam's new leader, To Lam, is on a 3-day visit to Beijing. Chinese President Xi Jinping held a welcome ceremony for To Lam earlier. This is Mr. Lam's first state visit since taking office 2 weeks ago. The meeting reaffirms close economic and trade relations between the communist neighbors, despite boundary disputes over the South China Sea. Beijing has hailed the Vietnam leader's visit as strategically significant.
中方始终将越南作为周边外交优先方向，支持越南坚持党的领导，走符合本国国情的社会主义道路，深入推进革新开放和社会主义现代化事业。 Tôi và ban lãnh đạo cấp cao Đảng, Nhà nước Việt Nam rất mong muốn cùng đồng chí Tổng Bí thư, Chủ tịch nước Trung Quốc Tập Cận Bình và ban lãnh đạo cấp cao Đảng, Nhà nước Trung Quốc không ngừng vun đắp truyền thống hữu nghị, tiếp tục làm sâu sắc và nâng tầm quan hệ đối tác hợp tác chiến lược toàn diện, xây dựng cộng đồng chia sẻ tương lai Việt Nam Trung Quốc.
For more insights on the Vietnamese leader's visit to China, we'll be speaking with Nguyen Kak Sa, visiting fellow from the Vietnam Studies program at IC's Yusof Ishak Institute later this hour. Coming up on East Asia tonight, 7-Eleven owner becomes the largest ever Japanese target of a foreign buyout, valued at around $31 billion. Plus, Japan is gearing up for its biggest IPO in roughly 6 years. Hello again. Good to have your company on East Asia tonight. You're just in time for business news with Roland Lim. So, Roland, the ripple effects of the slowdown in China's economy or construction sector, rather, is being felt down under?
Right you are. The world's biggest iron ore producer is now taking a hit from what was once a much lucrative trade. Australia says that falling iron ore prices could burn a $2 billion hole in its budget over the next 4 years. That's as troubles in China's massive construction sector causes demand for the steel to drop, leading iron ore prices to slump about 30% since the start of the year. The ripple effects of that are now being felt by the world's biggest producer of iron ore. Now, while a drop in tax receipts from sales of iron ore had been forecast in last May's budget, prices for the commodity has fallen even further and more quickly than expected. Last week, the price fell 7.5% to $81.80 per tonne, and that's below the Treasury's forecast of $83. Now, if that trend continues, the long-run price could hit $60 per tonne 6 months earlier than predicted, resulting in a $2 billion shortfall in revenue. The world's biggest steelmaker already warning the industry downturn could be steeper than back in 2008 or 2015. Some 85% of Australia's iron ore went to China last year, leaving it highly exposed to the world's second biggest economy. Shares down for Australia's major iron ore producers. BHP down 13% from 6 months ago, Rio Tinto down by about 16%, and Fortescue down 40%. Japan is targeting a $4.7 billion valuation for Tokyo Metro in what would be the country's biggest listing in 6 years. Sources say it could happen as early as the end of October. Tokyo Metro is the larger of the city's 2 subway operators and a major piece of its vast rail network. The national government and the city jointly owns 100% of the operator. The 2 governments are reportedly planning to arrange a meeting of brokerages within a week for a briefing for the IPO. Now, sources add that the governments are expected to receive approval for the listing from the Tokyo Stock Exchange as soon as mid-September. Now, with half of the company to be sold, the valuation could raise nearly $2.4 billion, becoming the biggest IPO in Japan since SoftBank listed its wireless unit back in 2018. Now, Tokyo's government says the timing of the sale is yet to be fixed, while Tokyo Metro has declined to comment on the progress of the IPO. Tokyo Metro carries over 6 million passengers every day over its 195-kilometer network. Now, it could be the biggest foreign takeover of a Japanese company ever, valued at $31 billion. 7&I Holdings, parent of the 7-Eleven chain of convenience stores, is scrutinizing a potential buyer proposal by Canada's Alimentation Couche-Tard, which controls the Circle K brand. Now, Couche-Tard's approach to 7&I's holdings follows more than a year of on-off talks between the 2 retailers. It has more than 17,000 stores in 30 countries worldwide. 7&I has 85,000 stores worldwide. Management at 7&I has appointed an independent committee to consider the takeover offer on whether the price is right and if it will lead to longer-term gains. Now, should the board reject Couche-Tard's offer, the Canadian giant may launch a takeover bid without 7&I's consent. Market watchers also say that the move from Kushtar could also draw other bidders for 7&I. The 7&I stock price closing up 23% today at 2,161 yen, hitting the upper end of its intraday trading limit. Sharp contrast to the Nikkei's negative close. Let's check in on the Japanese markets. The Nikkei, as mentioned earlier, did fall today, extending losses as the yen strengthened against the dollar. The Nikkei closing down 1.77% lower, snapping a 5-day winning streak that pushed the index 8.7% up last week. The broader topics fell 1.4%. Now, meantime, shares of Japanese space startup Astroscale rose 19% today. The company says it would sign an $81 million contract with Japan's space agency to remove debris from the Earth's orbit. Now, debris is becoming increasingly a risk for space missions as the number of satellites in orbit has risen sharply. Trade was brisk in Greater China after Beijing pledged further steps to support economic recovery while cautioning that it won't be adopting, quote, drastic measures. The Shanghai Composite put on 0.5%, Shenzhen marginally higher. Hang Seng Index adding 0.8%, investor sentiment being supported by the prospect of the U.S. economy likely dodging a recession. Meantime, China's stock exchanges will stop releasing daily data on overseas fund flows starting today, which means that investors lose a key sentiment indicator to track China's more than $8 trillion market. Now, foreign funds have steadily dried up from the market, taking the year-to-date tally to negative as of Friday. The move was first hinted at back in April. Analysts view it as another effort by authorities to prop up the market, hoping to reduce volatility induced by such data and instead get investors to focus on longer-term indicators. Earlier, Goldman Sachs chief Asia-Pacific equity strategist Timothy Mo explained why Beijing's move to stop releasing daily data on overseas funds flows is no cause for alarm.
The incremental impact of today's development, the cessation of publication of data on northbound flows, this has been well flagged. So I don't think there's going to be really any major impact that's already been digested by the market. The bigger picture, of course, is that it's unfortunate that one doesn't have this data because it has been a good gauge to see how foreigners have been looking at the onshore market. We're now going to have only quarterly data that will be coming out, and we will be given information about the level of foreign ownership. So we'll have to pay financial detective in terms of backing out what flows have been, but it's going to be coming out with quite a lag, so it will be much less market relevant than it was before. I will note, however, that we still will get southbound data, which is flows coming in from onshore China into the Hong Kong stock market. That will still continue to be published, and just to note, that's actually the strongest flow that we see for China. It's about 59 billion year to date as of Friday's close. So that onshore buying of the Hong Kong stock market has actually been probably one of the most positive factors for that particular, for the offshore China stocks.
That's all for me. Back to you, Telly.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, China and Vietnam reaffirm ties as leader To Lam makes his first state visit to Beijing. We'll speak to an expert to unpack their so-called unbreakable bond. And Tokyo's Yasukuni Shrine, a controversial symbol of Japan's wartime past, vandalized yet again. Beijing accuses the Philippines of a deliberate collision in the South China Sea, while Manila fires back, accusing Chinese ships of aggressive maneuvers. U.S. and South Korea begin annual drills to bolster defense against North Korea, but protesters in Seoul condemn the exercises as a provocation that could spark nuclear war. And China and Vietnam sign more than a dozen agreements, including deals of railways, central bank cooperation, and trade. This comes as Vietnam's new leader, To Lam, is on a 3-day visit to Beijing. Earlier, Chinese President Xi Jinping held a welcome ceremony for his Vietnamese counterpart. Well, this is Mr. Lam's first state visit since taking office 2 weeks ago. The meeting reaffirms close economic and trade relations between the communist neighbors, despite boundary disputes over the South China Sea. Well, Beijing says that the Vietnam leader's visit is strategically significant.
中方始终将越南作为
周边外交优先方向，支持越南坚持党的领导，走符合本国国情的社会主义道路，深入推进革新开放和社会主义现代化事业。
And for more insights, we are joined by Nguyen Kak Za, visiting fellow Vietnam Studies program at IC's Yusof Ishak Institute. Well, thanks so much for joining us on East Asia Tonight, Za. So let's just talk about this meeting in Beijing. Help us understand, right? They talked about this unshakable party bond. How can that coexist with the contentious conflict that they have in the South China Sea? And this bond, while unshakable as it is it possibly also unbreakable?
Well, I think it's very important to note that both countries are communists and they share the state ideology. So although they have a lot of disputes over the South China Sea, like Vietnam and the Philippines, Vietnam actually needs to have the support of China to maintain their regime survival. And also, more importantly, Vietnam has a lot of trade interests and economic interests with China. China is Vietnam's biggest trade partner. And so Vietnam is very dependent on China for their economic development. So that's why for Vietnam, it's important to maintain this strong bilateral relationship. And when Tolam chose China as the first foreign destination of his trip, I think it's signify Tolam's priorities in putting China as a priorities of his economic and foreign policy in the coming time.
But Za, we have to, we have to remind ourselves that Vietnam had their first joint drills with the Philippine Coast Guard earlier this month, right? And it seems to somewhat contradict with this narrative of an unshakable bond. But you did mention that they do share this communist state ideology, and that could perhaps, surpass the SCS tensions. But I mean, how do you interpret this move, though? The implications that this would have for China-Vietnam relations?
Well, I think we should put it into the context of Vietnam's bamboo diplomacy. So for Vietnam, it's important to note that why they still have some disputes with China, especially on the South China Sea. And they know that they have to limit the damage of the disputes in order to look into a bigger picture of economic and foreign policy cooperation. And also Vietnam and China, to some extent, they try to solve the problem bilaterally, and to some extent to reduce the damage of the tensions on the South China Sea. Although Vietnam and the Philippines are, I would say, the most vocal claimant states on the South China Sea dispute with China, Vietnam knows that if they cannot manage the relationship well, they cannot really counter China militarily on the South China Sea, and so they have to really maximize their foreign policy approach and try to play different strategies in order to convince China to take a different approach on the South China Sea, while at the same time maintain a good trade and economic relationship with China, as they are the most important economic player in Vietnam's economic strategy for the coming time.
Right. And since the president, Tolam, he's taken the reins in Vietnam, how would you say his foreign policy approach is? Does it deviate quite a fair bit from his predecessor, or you think it's more or less the same?
I think it's very hard to know because Tolam is a career policeman. He developed his career via the Ministry of Public Security. So we don't really know a lot about his ideas of foreign policy directions. But I think for the coming time, Tolam will maintain the bamboo diplomacy approach initiated by General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trọng before him, because first, Tolam wants to be seen as a rightful heir of Nguyen Phu Trọng because of a lot of political turbulence in the past few years under the anti-corruption campaign. So Tolam wants to be seen as someone who succeeds Nguyen Phu Trọng legitimately, so he wants to maintain that approach. And secondly, and I think more importantly, the bamboo diplomacy approach for Vietnam is actually working quite well, and there's no reason for Tolam to do that. So actually, if we look at the visit by Tolam now, although some people might think that it signifies Vietnam's, let's say, closer approachment with China, but at the same time, it may be preempt another, Vietnam and U.S. further development in their bilateral relationship, because Tolam will come to New York next month, and then he would be expected to meet American leaders there, and there might be some developments on that side as well. So I think we have to put it into a very important context of bamboo diplomacy to understand the significance of this trip to China by Tolam.
Yeah, so this bamboo diplomacy that you've been talking about, but how do you think Tolam is going to be navigating this this tightrope though between China and the U.S. and to what extent is it's going to be dependent on who becomes the next U.S. president?
Well, I think it's very important to note that for Vietnam, it's important to maintain the regime survival. So on that front, Vietnam needs China's support because they don't trust the West or America because they're always concerned about regime security. But Vietnam also needs the US and Western partners for national security, especially on the South China Sea dispute that you mentioned earlier. And I think this would be a very important test for Vietnam for the upcoming US election, because if Trump, for example, becomes the next president, then there would be a lot of pressure on Vietnam-Chinese ties, because there are a lot of Chinese investment and trade via Vietnam and route to Vietnam to the US. And this problem of transshipment would be a big problem because Trump would likely punish Vietnam. He calls out Vietnam the single worst trade abuser a few years ago, and he's likely to pick up Vietnam as the next target of his trade punishment. If Harris becomes a president, then it would be likely easier for Vietnam to approach, because Harris likely maintained the same approach by Biden, which is very close to Vietnam, and they really lenient on Vietnam trade practices and as well as Vietnam human rights and democracy problems. For Vietnam, better to have Harris, but it's very hard to know for sure. And I think Vietnamese leaders know this really well and is preparing for many scenarios after the U.S. election later this year.
And I want to talk about the China-Vietnam cross-border rail project, which aims to boost economic ties. Can you just tell us what are some of the potential economic benefits and the strategic implications or the challenges as well of this rail project for both for Vietnam?
Well, just a very interesting fact is that the South China and the North Vietnam has a lot of potential for cooperation. So the Chinese province of Quảng Đông, for example, has a trade relationship with Vietnam, which have the volume of over 48 billion US dollars. So it's like triple Vietnam and Russia trade relationship. So it's a very, very important part of Vietnam to really have a good connection with the South China. And more importantly, Vietnam, if you look at around Southeast Asia, Vietnam is a country which has been quite hesitant to receive Belt Road Initiative projects by China. So I think the Chinese leaders in Beijing want Vietnam to more, receptive to BRI investments. And for the Vietnamese side, because of the growing economies, they really need more infrastructural investment. But they have been a little bit cautious of the intention of Chinese leaders for the Belt Road Initiative. So I think the trip by Tolam might signify a more open reception of Vietnam for big mega infrastructure projects invested by China. And I think the railway connection would be the first step for that.
And many thanks for your insights. Nguyen Kak Za, visiting fellow Vietnam Studies Program at IC's Yusof Ishak Institute, speaking to us from Adelaide. In other news, the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo has been vandalized for the second time in 3 months. A shrine official has condemned the incident, calling it deplorable. A profanity, along with a phrase condemning Japanese militarism, was written in Chinese with what appeared to be black markers on a stone pillar. Authorities promptly covered part of the pillar up upon discovery. Well, in May, a stone pillar at the shrine was found spray-painted red. A Chinese national living in Tokyo was arrested for that act. The shrine, which honors some 2.5 million of Japan's fallen, including convicted war criminals, is regularly visited by Japanese officials. Last Thursday, on the 79th anniversary of Japan's surrender in World War II, saw 3 government ministers pay homage. Such visits has historically caused diplomatic tensions with countries that previously suffered from Japanese militarism, including South Korea and China. Twin earthquakes rattled regions north of Tokyo early this Monday. The first tremor, measuring a magnitude 4.7, shook Ibaraki and surrounding prefectures, close to 1 a.m. local time. It was followed by a stronger magnitude 5.1 quake just 2 minutes later. Well, the quick succession prompted a warning from the authorities, urging residents to be on alert for aftershocks of a similar magnitude in the coming days. Another break is up next, but coming up in East Asia tonight, how China is counting on moviegoers to boost its domestic consumption. It seems like China remains a coveted market for foreign films despite muted figures for its summer box office. During the first 2 months of this year's prime screening season, ticket sales plunged by more than 40% compared to last year. And that's despite moves by Chinese authorities to bring more people to cinemas to boost consumer spending. Well, to tell us more, we have with us Lauren Ong joining us live from Beijing. So, Lauren, tell us, how have officials been trying to encourage more people to spend at their local theatres?
Well, boosting domestic consumption has been something we've been hearing increasingly of as authorities circle in on one of its biggest drag in China's economy, as laid out in broad policy directions at the Communist Party's twice-a-decade third plenum last month. And recently in the headlines, you've been hearing moves to promote spending on household appliances as well as automobiles. But actually, there's also plans to boost entertainment and cultural consumption. So according to China's State Council, the highest administrative governing body, there are actually plans to enrich the supply and distribution of films, as well as to encourage more to consume them. And how this has manifested is through free tickets, discounts during certain periods, and in March, a commitment by film regulators to actually be more open and inclusive when it comes to film imports. And while there's a lack of specifics, why this is significant is because these are the film regulators that have the final say on what's ultimately released in the China's film market. And usually the reasons for why something's released here or not can be unpredictable, and also a lot is left for interpretation. And so this is really an opening up of the rules and regulations. And to have a better look of what it takes to bring a foreign film here, let's listen in.
It's one of many responses from these cinema goers in Beijing who got an exclusive preview of a Singaporean film and even a chat with some of its stars. According to the producers, the film's relatable narrative is a key reason why this foreign film was able to land in cities across China nationwide, a historic feat for filmmakers in Singapore who have been trying to do so for decades. China's film industry is well known for its labyrinth of restrictions for foreign films, with quotas on the number of film imports and censorship reviews to pass. These got even tighter in 2018, where the Communist Party of China's propaganda department took over the role of media regulation. No-go content includes narratives that are deemed to threaten national security and endanger China's sovereignty or the basic principles of its constitution. To ensure they could get approval, one of the firms that co-produced the Singaporean movie said discussions about the storyline took years, with consultations with their Chinese offices on what would likely be greenlit without edits.
We are not sure about the regulatory, their movie regulatory in China. So I think it will be an obstacle for us to really, and the genre, the culture in China. I mean, we have to do some topic and some story that can actually resonate with the Chinese audience, then able to make it here.
The movie is centered on a student from Shanghai and his experience in the Singapore education system. It even features well-known Chinese actress Hu Jing as one of the lead actors. While breaking into China's market is a golden badge for many filmmakers, its monetary returns are just as rewarding. For some foreign movies, ticket sales have fared better in China than in their home countries. This year, Japanese animation film The Boy and the Heron fared better in China than in Japan and the North American markets. And there could be more in the future as China's State Council turns to the film industry to boost domestic consumption, a key part of plans to counter China's sluggish economy. Earlier this month, authorities started a 3-month promotion season, injecting some $10 million in a campaign to get more to go to the cinema. The free tickets and discounted coupons come as Chinese consumers increasingly choose to watch films online, with popular Chinese online streaming platforms ramping up competition in the entertainment industry. But many obstacles still stand.
From the local media attention to the premiere guest list, these are key parts of what makes the popularity and success of a film. But a movie premiere and even pre-marketing release campaigns typically need some lead time, which is something not every foreign film has the luxury of having.
Nowadays, actually, it's uncertain, and particularly so once they submit their films and for the censorship, to be reviewed, but the result is so uncertain actually. So we do not know whether it could be passed or not.
Some U.S. studios say they were given approval just days before the release dates, allowing little time to create effective marketing campaigns. In contrast, they say domestic films had months to do so. It's also often hard to predict what will be censored. At times, firms are required to edit their films for the Chinese audience. Still, analysts say China's film market is one filmmakers cannot ignore, given its size and potential to grow. It's currently the second largest box office in the world after Hollywood, accounting for almost a quarter of global ticket sales.
Well, Lauren, just picking up from your story there, you said that China's film market is one that filmmakers cannot ignore. And just to give some context, Beijing's market growth rate has outpaced most countries around the world, which is quite impressive. So what is the secret sauce behind China's film industry potential?
Well, Italy, as of 2023, China is actually the second largest film market in the entire world after the United States. And at 7.5 billion, it actually accounts for about a quarter of the global total. And at one point, it was actually the biggest during the years of 2020 and 2021. But since then, analysts say domestic productions are still wrapping up and cinemas are still recovering from the past 2 years. But these are signs that there's still a potential for China's film market to grow. And indeed, China's film industry is growing at a pace of 83%, outpacing the global rate of just over 30%. And then there's also the potential of third-tier countries like Yangzhou and Zhenjiang. And these are cities that have a rise in income spending, rise in standard of living, more disposable income. And so more people are willing to spend on movie tickets. And a physical manifestation of this is the rise of theaters in these cities. And so the type of films that the people in these cities are more palatable towards may vary because they're less international than the larger cities. And this really impacts whether the language is suitable or the type of content is suitable. So I spoke to some people to get a better sense of what it takes to have them watch foreign films in cinemas. Let's listen in.
只要是这种说中文我能听懂就行。要不然我听不懂，除非有翻译中文。
我可能自己会比较喜欢看两类吧，就是一类是那种爱情轻喜剧 （romantic comedy），就作为放松的；然后另外一类就是可能比较喜欢看一些文化教育类的。
我可能看国内电影比较多一点。那现在国家给的这个机会，肯定是去多多学习更多的文化。
Yeah, so these really show how language and perhaps the content of films can really pose limitations even as more are being done to bring more films into China. And this is ever more important when we look at how they are looking to diversify the offerings. With China, for instance, working with more partner countries from the Belt and Road Film Festival Alliance that includes partner countries like Russia, Malaysia, and Thailand, and also to get a sense of how hard these film regulators go. It's like, for example, if we see the 2015 premiere, the hotly anticipated premiere of the 50 Shades of Grey, it was unceremoniously cancelled because of its racy content. And a lot of these restrictions are very much opaque, but even so, there's more than 30 films that have been screened in China so far that are imported, and but these are still far from pre-pandemic levels.
Yeah, so Lauren, I'm curious to know, right, how has China been using its films to position itself in a more favorable light, sort of using it as a tool of soft power for Beijing?
Yeah, so we've mentioned a little bit about how these films might be edited or changed before they can make their debut in China. And Hollywood films especially, they've been increasingly censored as China grew to global prominence in the film industry. An example being the latest Top Gun movie. It features a jacket with the Taiwan flag, for instance. And it was edited out eventually, but it drew massive media attention. And in the end, it did not even premiere in China. So this is an example of analysts say how some film productions, they might, like the profits of entering a China market might not outweigh the geopolitical concerns it might bring. And these geopolitical tensions are increasingly a deterrent factor for foreign films to consider before they enter the foreign market. But as one analyst puts it, it might all be down to bargaining power. Let's listen in.
Because the Chinese film market is so attractive, still very attractive. And Chinese government has relatively higher bargaining power, actually. But firms have a lot of choices, particularly for multinational companies. So they can enter Chinese market. They can also enter some other foreign markets, right? So if firms have some reactions which have negatively impact on such kind of effectiveness of policies, then governments will have some slight or some changes of their policies.
Yeah, so basically the fact that China's film market is so big, analysts say it's something filmmakers cannot ignore, especially since many need access to it to recuperate losses. And on the flip side, China is looking to boost its domestic consumption, and a part of that includes having more Hollywood films to boost ticket sales.
I really enjoyed your story there. Thanks very much, Lauren Ong, live in Beijing. And for more of our coverage on the Chinese entertainment landscape, do check out CNA.Asia for stories such as this one on micro-dramas, specifically those bite-sized chunks, just 1 to 2 minutes long, that are taking viewers both locally and abroad by storm. And that does it for this Monday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at CNA.Asia. And you can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, and on X. Thanks for your company.